In this video, we are going to fill in the unit circle and talk about how to find the tangent of a certain angle on the unit circle. So we've been talking over the past couple of videos on the first quadrant of the unit circle. And if you look at the first quadrant, it's already filled out with the 30 degrees, 45 degrees, and 60 degrees. And then you get these points from these special right triangles. In the first quadrant of the unit circle, those are all your reference angles. So every angle refers back to the first quadrant angles, and then we use those same points all the way through. So what we haven't talked about is filling in the points for 0 degrees. If you take cosine of 0 degrees, you get a value of 1. And if you take sine of 0 degrees, you get 0. So here we have that point as well. And then we have to go up to 90 degrees to get that point. And if you take a cosine of 90 degrees in your calculator, you get 0. And if you take sine of 90 degrees in your calculator, you are going to get 1. So now we have those points. And we have the first quadrant completely filled out. Now we're going to figure out the rest of the unit circle. And we're going to use the pattern here where we're always going to have two 30, 60, 90 triangles. So we have the 30 degrees, the 60 degrees, and if you look at 30 degrees, 60 degrees, and 90 degrees, they're all increasing by 30. So we can use this pattern to fill in a lot of the other angles in the unit circle. So 30 degrees plus 90 is 120. And then 120 plus 30 gives you 150. But remember, we have to skip that middle angle because that's our 45, 90 triangle in the middle there. So then we keep adding 30 degrees. 150 plus 180 gives us, or 150 plus 30 gives us 180. So then we keep following that pattern all the way through the unit circle. Okay, so now I've just filled out the rest of the unit circle. We filled out the first two quadrants together. I filled out 3 and 4, all the way up to where you end with 360 degrees, because the full way around a circle is 360 degrees. Now we're going to fill in the 45, 90 triangles all the way through the unit circles. We do that by adding 45 degrees. So if we take 45 plus 45, we get 90, plus another 45 gives us 135. And then 135 plus 45 gives us 180, which we already have. And then we're going to keep filling it out. Add 45 degrees to 180, you get 225. Add 45 degrees to 225, you get 270. And then we keep going with the fourth quadrant. We get 315 and then 360. So now we do have the radian measures. For the radian measures, for right now, we're just going to convert using a conversion factor. So 120 degrees times pi over 180 will give you this radian measure of 2 pi over 3. So we're going to fill in those 2 pi over 3. So I'm going to fill in the rest of the radian measures using the conversion factors. Okay, so what I have just done here is I have filled out the whole entire unit circle with radian measures all the way to the last one of 2 pi. So now we need to fill in the remaining points, which again, we refer back to the reference angles. So if we look at 2 pi over 3, or we look at 120, either one of those, it refers us back to the pi over 3 in the 60 degrees. So our point here, I don't have enough space to fill in there, so our point here is 1/2 square root of 3 over 2. And then we're going to fill in the signs in a second. But then we have 3 pi over 4, or 135, which we refer back to the 45-degree angle, or pi over 4, which is square root of 2 over 2. And then we're going to fill in that last point. And if we look at 5 pi over 6, we refer back to pi over 6, or 30 degrees. And we have the square root of 3 over 2 and 1/2. So looking at these, we have to make sure, just like we did previously, we have to look at the signs. So in quadrant 2, x is negative. So all of these first coordinates have to be negative, but y is positive, so you're fine. So I'm going to go through and fill out all these points, and then we'll assign signs to the x and y coordinates. Before I fill in the rest of the unit circle, let's look at pi and 180. If we take cosine of pi or cosine of 180, we're going to get a -1. And then sine of 180 is 0. And then let's also look at 3 pi over 2 and 270. If we take cosine of 3 pi over 2, or we take cosine of 270 degrees, we get an x value of 0. And then taking sine of those angles, you get -1. So now I'm going to fill in the x and y points referring back to the reference angles. Okay, so now we have all those points filled in. We just have to make sure that we get the signs of the coordinates right. So if we look at quadrant 3, we have 7 pi over 6, 210 degrees, which refers back to the reference angle of 30 degrees in pi over 6. So we have the same point, but we have to figure out the sign. And in quadrant 3, both x and y are negative. So we're going to make all these x and y points negative. So now quadrant 4, you do the same thing with, only this time the x coordinate is positive and the y coordinate is negative. So we're going to change all the y coordinates to being negative. And that is how we fill out the unit circle. We always refer back to that first quadrant. And we fill out the points referring back to those reference angles as well. So now we're going to go through an example of finding tangent. So if we want to find the tangent of -5 pi over 6, we first have to figure out where that is on the unit circle, and we also have to figure out what reference angle we have. So the reference angle, if it's in radians, we can look at the denominator. So the reference angle is pi over 6, which if we refer back to our unit circle, pi over 6 has a point of square root of 3 over 2, comma, 1/2. So now -5 pi over 6, you can refer back to that unit circle. We can also convert it to degrees. There's many ways that we can find the tangent of negative 5 pi over 6. Some people like radians, and then we also could find it by converting it to degrees. People are used to degrees, so sometimes that's the go-to method here, but either one works. So negative 5 pi over 6 times 180 over pi, the pi's cancel, and that's going to equal negative 150 degrees. That allows us to see that negative 150 degrees is in quadrant 3. Remember that if you go in the opposite direction, we have negative degrees. So negative 150 degrees is somewhere within this third quadrant. So now we have our point. It's in quadrant 3, which means that our point has a negative x, so negative root 3 over 2, and negative 1/2. But we do need tangent. So before we were doing cosine or sine, so we could just either take one of those x or y values. But tangent, remember that tangent is sine over cosine. So knowing that tangent is equal to sine over cosine, we are going to have to take the y value and put it on top of the x value. It is equal to negative 1/2 over negative root 3 over 2. Because remember, the x value is cosine, the y value is sine. So sine over cosine is y over x. And now we need to remember how to divide fractions. We keep the first fraction and then we multiply and flip the second fraction. The 2's will cancel. You have a negative times a negative. That makes a positive. You have 1 over root 3. Well, 1 over root 3, we can't have a square root in the denominator. So that takes us back to rationalizing, where we have to multiply the top and the bottom by square root of 3. 1 times square root of 3 is square root of 3. Square root of 3 times square root of 3 is 3. So our final answer for the tangent of negative 5 pi over 6 is square root of 3 over 3. So now, what if we were asked to find tangent of 3 pi? So if we look at our unit circle or our xy axis, we have the initial side, and it's going to rotate to pi, then rotate all the way around to 2 pi, and then it has to go one more to 3 pi. So our point on the unit circle there, if you rewind to the beginning of the video, our point on the unit circle for 3 pi, which is equal to pi, we have negative 1, 0. So now tangent of 3 pi is equal to 0 over negative 1, which is equal to 0. So now you can practice finding tangent on your own. We will work on the unit circle a little bit more as well. But now try some of those tangents on your own.